Following on from Selam, I am going to talk about a story related to negotiations. Selam does the big dog negotiations, but back in the day, before Oxford Net Zero started, when I was the student union vice president representing students' concerns on climate, I myself found myself in the midst of a different kind of negotiation. I have to say that being the first fellow and then having to follow all the other fellows today is really quite the challenge. We have just such an incredible breadth, which I hope you've all seen today, but also a depth of disciplined research, challenging questions. I think our little debate on stage really typifies the culture we've developed at Oxford Net Zero around challenging each other's ideas, representing different perspectives, whether it be the perspective of physics, of nature, of the economy, of social science. And I think that was what I was trying to do back in 2019 when I was standing on a frozen lawn with students who had camped out in front of one of the university's biggest and most well-endowed colleges. And they'd been camping there for 2.5 weeks. And I think at that point, the Vice Chancellor was concerned about hypothermia. And it was my job to figure out how to get students off the lawn, but more importantly, how to meet their demands, which were to align the university to a credible definition of net zero, including our investments, our own policies, our strategies. And the university was willing to play ball. We had some of the folks in this room really on our side. I mean, it's always been an alliance between students and climate scientists on this matter. There's always been a very clear and strong commitment that comes out of the classroom and comes out of that dialogue. But we had one problem. We had papers on the definition of net zero, but when I was trying to write a policy with the university staff, it was clear that there was no internationally agreed definition of net zero for an organization. So we didn't let that bother us. We don't take no for an answer at Oxford Net Zero, or what would have become Oxford Net Zero. We said to the university, why don't you help us figure this out? And we put together a research bid, and we took some of that nice COVID money that we got off of being a great innovator on the medical side of what we do at this university, and we were able to create an entire research program around this problem. And it turned out that it wasn't just Steve and Sam and Miles and Cameron and those of us that got together to start Net Zero who were trying to ask this question of how do you do net zero and get it right? It was the world's. Nigel Topping, who is here with us today, was asking that question in the highest levels of business. We had cities, states, and region coalitions that were springing up around this tricky definition. And it was exactly the time, with the UK hosting the COP presidency, for us to come together around a common minimum criteria. And universities do one thing very well. We don't always get the facts perfectly, we don't always have the answers, we don't always communicate perfectly, but we do convene very well. And we ask hard questions and we pursue them with integrity. And so what we were able to offer that ecosystem and that movement in that moment was just a convening space. And then we became vessels for the answer. And I'd like to think that we continue to do that as the definition of net zero and even the title or the framing or the leverage points evolve. But it was a time of, as kind of Solitaire pointed out earlier, a time of optimism, a time of the Greta effect. There's a statistically significant effect of the school strike movements and carbon credit purchases. This is a classic Overton-Windhill issue. I'm sure Greta herself would not be particularly pleased with that because she's rather skeptical of sort of market reforms, but I think that that shows the power of movements, that finance flows when movements grow. And at the time, we also had CEOs jumping up on stage and saying, yep, I want to be on stage. I want to be on stage with Nigel. I want to be on stage with Alex Sharma. And I want to be seen to be doing the right thing. So the levers that we had to play with at that time are not the levers that we have today. But the students' question that was posed on that frozen lawn is still something that we can pursue and will pursue in the halls of power. So what does it mean to be a net zero-aligned organization? What does it mean to be a net zero-aligned business? There are the businesses that are going brown to green, the big businesses, and then there are the green innovators. So the Race to Zero campaign that Nigel and the team started with the UN backing and with such an incredible effort of global movement effort had two sides to it. It had the side that was just thinking about how organizations could shift their strategies, but it also had this other side focused on innovation. And that was actually empirically grounded. It's ultimately Tim Lenton and the system thinkers. We've got Cameron in the room, the sensitive intervention point guys who want to do a little bit of high impact stuff that's really well strategized for an outsized impact. And the governance thinkers, perhaps your Tom Hales might be in this category, people who understand the incremental, iterative governance process that is going to get us to net zero through a collective of individual targets. And my research now, my thesis, which as all of you know, I've been working on for quite some time while trying to develop a research and action program with Oxford Net Zero, is exploring that tension between those two sides. And when I go to businesses, and now I've had the privilege working with all of you to engage hundreds of businesses, we find that they don't see a tension between those sides. Sometimes the tension plays off in terms of where they should spend their money, but they see them as kind of two parts of a complete whole of what it means to get my organization to net zero and contribute to global net zero. So what's the problem then? We've got all this momentum. We've asked the right questions. We're starting to get clear answers. Businesses are starting to figure out their plans. Well, engagement is hard. And when we talked to businesses, we would ask three things. We would ask, how are your products shifting? We would ask, how are your policies shifting? How's your policy engagement shifting? And we would ask, how are you using the power of your portfolio of finance? But moreover, we were also asking kind of the governance questions. We were asking, I like to score net zero commitments on a nice acronym you can maybe remember around a dinner table. Short-term targets, that's the S. Full coverage of all greenhouse gases and scopes. A clear and outlined plan with careful considerations on how much and how they're offsetting. A robust reporting mechanism, and equity. And what we found, actually, thanks to the Net Zero Tracker, is that only about 250 companies, that's around 6 or 7% of those Forbes 2000 list, are meeting those minimum criteria. A lot of them, as Soli explained, are still trying to figure out what net zero means. So that means our job is not done. Our job is now to put the definitions of net zero into policy and practice, and to write the international standards that can help us get there in a comparable and fair way. So I continued to do my research. We weren't going to just write policy and engage without talking to companies. We talked to companies in every sector, the really high ambition consumer goods companies you might think of when you think of Net Zero Line Company, and the fossil fuel companies like the ones that Stuart works with. And I had one particular afternoon which was a real turning point for me. I had an opportunity to sit down in front of a small audience with the CEO of Shell. And I was promised as like the kind of respectable activist, like someone who wouldn't shout at him but would push him. I like to play that role. We had a really frank discussion. I thought he was really honest with me. I was not expecting him to be so honest with me. But when I asked him, how are you going to align your products to net zero? Will there be a geological fraction of your oil and gas that you're selling? He said no, not if the money's not there. When I asked him, how are you going to align your portfolio of finance to net zero? He said, I'll let the investors tell us. And when I asked him, how is your policy engagement aligning to your target and your strategy and your plan? His team said, carbon pricing? That would be nice. That would be nice. But how? I went away from that day shaking. It was actually a really good thing that Miles was there to give me a hug, because I was so mad, I practically couldn't think for the next 2 days. Luckily, I have an amazing team, and Alexis was there, and Matilda had just joined us, and we went back to the drawing board. We said, targets and pathways and reduction plans are not enough. It's time for us to redefine net zero. So we thought about those 3 areas where the Shell CEO had fallen short. And we thought, actually, it's not just his fault. We haven't really asked the world about their policy engagement, their portfolio of climate finance, or their product alignment to net zero. So we wrote a paper called Leveraging Your Spheres of Influence, how you can align your policy engagement, your products, and your portfolio of climate finance to net zero. And it kind of went viral thanks to Soli's help and a helpful HBR editor. Now we're working with companies all around the world to not just consider what footprint they're going to leave behind, but also what their legacy will be in terms of contributing to the global net zero picture. And then we had to go back to the drawing board and convince all of our friends in the international standards system that they also should include that in the definition of net zero. And if you've ever been a part of an international standard organization negotiation meeting, it's like an Athenian arena without the armor, and like 100 of the world's best and most fractious experts from civil society, you've got your FAR Greens, industry, you've definitely got your oil and gas, and then member organizations from every national standards body that they could bring into the process. And ISO has 169 different international standards bodies. So you tell them that their definition of net zero that they've been operating from, which we're trying to write a standard on for the last 3 years, is incorrect, and they absolutely flip out. It's taken me probably 2.5 years to bring a new kind of concept of net zero into this standard that addresses the systemic levers as well as the carbon reduction measures. And I can't tell you what's going to be in the standard yet, because just like Stuart has NDAs, I have a commitment to governance. But what I can say is that it has been an awesome, dialogic, agonistic process that really, I think, exemplifies what Alexis was saying about what we need to do in terms of bringing back democracy into the climate dialogue. Instead of seeing companies as the kind of enemies or as the organizations that were constantly falling short in the way I thought of them when I first started this job, honestly, I see companies as thought leaders who can help me understand how I get from point A to point B. When I talk to some of the people who I've developed relationships with in the international standards process, they tell me, I understand where you want to go, you just can't write it that way. And over maybe years of iteration, we get to a position that works with their practicalities and their real-world challenges in terms of how they implement the standards, and works with my ambition that comes from deeply a perspective and commitment to science. And so when I turn back and think about those frozen students who've probably all graduated and are happily on to their next careers at this point, I like to think that within the next year, as the international standards are published, I'll have an answer for them. And it's really thanks to all of you and to every single one of the researchers and fellows and directors and development support from the university that has made it possible for us to have an answer for those students. So my ask to you all is, when those standards come out, please help us get them into the hands of policy and practice so that the definition of net zero can go from a frozen lawn to a global movement. Thank you.